is ready to hatch. But remember, when it does, it will be a fish. If it were to hatch while buried here in the sand, far from the water, it wouldn't have a chance in the world to live. But the grunion egg never hatches until the water reaches it, and then it hatches instantly. You can keep these eggs buried in the sand for weeks or months and they won't hatch. But now, let's pour some salt water on them and see what happens. This mysterious hatching of the egg is just as definitely connected with the movement of the tides as is the spawning. Suppose the eggs were laid any night before the peak tide. A higher tide the following night would wash them out and expose them to their enemies. Or if they were laid on a night too long after the peak, they would be washed out by a rising tide just a few nights later before they had a chance to develop. Actually, there are only a few nights when the grunion can lay her eggs successfully. When the tide is at its peak or the first few nights after the peak. And she must choose not only the right night, but the right hour of that night, even if she should lay her eggs on the right night. But when the tide is still rising, they would be washed out by that very tide. Or if she should wait too long after the peak and lay her eggs while that night's tide is receding, they would be washed out by the rising tide of the next night and destroyed. Only during this magic hour can the eggs be laid where they will develop safely. No sea captain can guide his vessel safely without a knowledge of the tides. But the grunion possesses a far better knowledge of the tides than the most experienced mariner, and is able to turn these tides to its own advantage, and by them preserve its very life and the life of its young. Remember that first garden you had when you were a youngster? You planted the seeds and covered them so carefully. You rather expected the plants to pop out of the ground like this, but somehow it didn't work out quite that way. As you waited, you got to wondering, maybe I planted those seeds upside down. Well, is there a right and a wrong end to a seed? On opening a bean seed, we find the embryonic root points in a definite direction. This determines the direction of initial growth. So it is possible to plant a seed upside down. But no matter which way the seed is placed in the ground, the plant always grows in the right direction. Even if we try to fool the growing seed, it doesn't get mixed up. The root reverses its direction and continues to grow downward. Now the shoot grows up because up is the place to find the light it must have. But if light can't be found by growing upward, the shoot will grow in any direction to reach it, even if it has to detour through a small hole to get there. Have you ever paused to consider the forces at work in a single tree? This tree is probably the oldest living thing on earth. It was almost 2,000 years old when Christ was born. For 3,800 years, this tree has been lifting at least 10 tons of water each day to its top, a total of more than 10 trillion foot-pounds of work. It is evident that there is an infinite power behind the mystery of life. But is this a blind, unintelligent, impersonal force? Well, you've been thinking, haven't you? That's all right. Don't feel embarrassed. It's a good thing. It's good to think once in a while about things like where you came from and why you're here, maybe about where you're going. Now about that matter of origin. No doubt you formed some opinion as to where you came from. Let's look at it this way. Suppose that you've never seen and you've never heard of a watch. And then one day you find one. You're intrigued by its appearance and by that strange sound it makes. If you're anything like most of us, it isn't long before you have the back off trying to find out what makes it tick. You're still more intrigued by the intricate wonders of that mechanism. If you're observant, it isn't long before you notice that there's a definite relationship between the movement of those hands and the passage of time. And you find that you have a useful article. But now you've got to explain the origin of the watch. You might develop the theory that the watch just happened, especially if you're trying to convince yourself that nobody owned the watch. You could argue that the atoms and the molecules of the various parts just got together by accident. But the simplest kind of logic should tell you that somebody made those parts and somebody put them together for a purpose. How about that eye with its automatic focus? Or that tiny musical instrument inside the human ear? Or that heart with its endless capacity for work? Or the bat with its radar magic? Is all this the product of blind chance? You know, when you come right down to it, there are only two views we can take. Either all this happened by accident or it's the result of design and plan. You might just shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's all a matter of personal opinion and let it go at that. You might, that is, but for the fact that this is an issue which vitally affects your whole life. It's going to determine how you think and how you live. For after all, if man is just an accident, then he has no responsibility except that which he chooses to impose upon himself. There's no law but the law of convenience and desire. There's no ultimate right or wrong. And when people think and live according to that philosophy, the result is chaos. But if, on the other hand, there's a plan, then there's a planner. If there's a design, there's a designer. In other words, there's a God. You know, it isn't hard to believe in a God. It's the simplest and the most logical thing in the world. Oh, I know. Some people are honestly confused by the maze of conflicting arguments. I guess they just try to make things too hard. For some people, the problem gets complicated when they begin to worry about who owns the watch. In other words, believing in God involves a responsibility. And they don't want that responsibility. They don't want anyone telling them what's right or wrong or how to live or act. Not even the God that made them. When you get as many people as there are in the world today living and acting as if there were no God, no wonder the world's in a mess. When we see the results of unbelief in the world today, it doesn't seem at all far-fetched to say that the only hope for the world as a whole or for you as an individual is faith in God. Not just belief in a supreme being or a great force, but belief in a personal God who loved you enough to provide a salvation for you. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life.